Welcome back. This is the Death Doorstep Devlog Part 6. Last week I focused a lot on improving the hit effect animations for the jellyfish enemies. This week I was wanting to focus on actually adding damage animation for the player, as well as just the whole overall functionality. Up until now, the player character had not taken any damage, which really sucks when you really want to start building levels sooner rather than later, so I decided to focus on that. And there it is right there. You can see when taking damage, there's a quick animation, very similar to how the jellyfish object takes damage, just with a little bit more impact. And then you go into an invincible state afterwards, where you're flashing. You can still hurt enemies, but they can no longer hurt you. So this week I'm going to show you basically how I cleaned up the jellyfish animation further from last week, and as well as added the hurt animation for the player. So let's get started. So if you remember from my last video, this jellyfish enter method is actually the collision handler for between the jellyfish and the mummy objects. If you remember last week, this actually used to be a lot thicker. I've simplified a lot of the logic and streamlined it so I can actually break it out for future cases better. A lot of the logic is handled via events being passed between the mummy and the jellyfish objects now. So let's actually walk through how it all works. So collision.other is the jellyfish object, and we're going to toss it directly into the hurt state for the jellyfish, which I will dive into in a little bit. And then once it's in that hurt state, we're going to fire a mummy whip collisions and the name of the root state event, so that the jellyfish knows how to react based on the mummy's current state. And then we have a little help, or a little hit helper here for the actual mummy to react as well. So let's focus on this to start. So you can see that hit creates a little spark animation. So I create a new hit effect, which I'll show you in slow-mo. So you can see the animation's kind of starting right here. It's a little hard to see right now. Basically, it starts as all black for contrast against the all white jellyfish on the initial impact as the screen freezes. And then the jellyfish will shake, the animation will play. There's the jellyfish spray that you saw from the previous week's video. But now there's also this orb here that basically symbolizes the initial hit animation, not so much the aftermath after the fact. So that happens on every hit now. As you can see, the rotation is randomized, but it's just a little, kind of shows the impact on the initial hit as opposed to the aftermath like the splash does. I want to add a little bit more polish there, so that kind of solves that issue. So the way I choose the position for that is the closest point to the jellyfish's XY position on the edge of the whip collider. This is a very useful method built into Unity that if you haven't used, it's very useful for positioning your hit effects based on the position of a collider to another point. And then we'll play the animation. Then after that, we're going to fire a hit start event to the current state. I'll show you that in a sec, and then we're going to trigger the slow motion here, which is this giant chunk, and then after the slow motion is done, trigger the hit end event in the exact same way we triggered the hit start. So I'm going to show you how that works in the whip 1 state. So you can see it's listening for a hit start event and a hit end event, and the handlers are down here. So on the slow-mo start, we're going to set the speed to 0 for the object, basically disable the physics speed. And then we're also going to disable the animation speed as well. So we're just going to freeze frame, freeze position, everything, just to show off the impact. And then when the slow-mo is all done, we're going to jump back into the animation, start doing the next segment, aka the follow-through. And then based on the current direction of the sprite, the direction it's facing, we're going to bounce away from the enemy, either a -1 or a 1 speed. And then we're going to give it a little bit of screen shake as well. So all of the different whip handlers, or whip states, have these sort of hit start, hit end handlers, so that I can basically change the way the current state will handle these hit events, which is very convenient for splitting up the logic. It was a lot cleaner than what I was doing in the previous week, and it gives me a better spot to build off of for the future. So jumping back to how the jellyfish actually handles this collision. So remember, we put it into the hurt state, and we fire this collision with the information about the hurt state. So you can see the jellyfish object is listening to all these different collision handlers based on the current state that the mummy is in. It uses a lot of the same handlers though, for whip 1, whip 2, whip air, whip run. Whip up is a little bit different because the jellyfish needs to be forced upwards as opposed to left or right based on the impact. So let's dive into Mummy Whip H real quick. So you can see the chain of events that happens here. So we have take some damage, disable the physics on the object, squish to show impact, flash white to show impact, and disable the collider on the object so that we don't get repeated collisions between it and the Mummy Whip. And then we're going to shake the object. So similar to the way I have camera shake, I also shake the jellyfish on impact just to show the impact. It actually uses the exact same service that the camera does, except it's on the jellyfish object instead of the actual camera object. So after the slow-mo delay, this is using the same value so that we know when the slow-mo ends in real time. And then on complete, we want to jump. This is saying start a timeout to go back into a non-hurt state, so back to chasing the mummy. Re-enable the collider so that you can hit the jellyfish even if it is in the hurt state still. And then let's re-enable the physics, and depending on whether the mummy attacked from the right or left side, set the speed for the object accordingly, as well as the splash that shoots out of the object after the whole shake and slow-mo happens. So now moving on to the player hurt collision, I'm going to show you kind of the structure of the mummy object. So there's actually two colliders on the mummy object, which I will show you. The first of which is on this sketch child right here. So you can see there's a box collider 2D. You can see the sizing. That kind of just sits around the actual player. It's used for jumping collisions as well as getting hurt, so incoming damage. And then on top of that, I also have a whip collider. So this is a collapsal collider 2D. This box actually changes depending on which whip animation you're doing, and it's not always active. So up until now, we've been dealing with mostly the whip collider. So if I attack, you can see the whip collider is currently disabled, but if I go to the sketch here, this box collider is still enabled, and the trigger, which is what actually triggers the events on the collider. But if I go back to the whip, and I'll step forward a little bit, a few frames, and then this frame here, the blur frame, is when the collider actually gets enabled. And then when that's over, it disables itself again. So it's only in that time period that you can actually hit enemies with the attack. And then you're just on the follow through. Up until now, I've only shown you the whip collider collisions, so let's actually focus more on the what I call the body collider collisions. So the body collisions handle jumping off of enemies as well as taking damage as the player. So here you can see is very similar to the whip collisions, the jellyfish enter event. There is a jellyfish enter event for the body collision. So first I have a little helper here to see if you can bounce off of collision.other, which as you know is the jellyfish. So can bounce just checks at this point to see if the other.y is less than the root.y. So if you can bounce, then put the other object into the hurt state, fire the body collision's bounce, which we saw on the jellyfish hurt state earlier, and then bounce, which is another helper which basically checks to see whether or not the jump button has been pressed recently, and if it does, flip into the air with extra height, or if it's not, just do like a little small bounce, as well as a little bit of camera shake, a little bit of slowdown, the usual impact. So skipping over the invincibility portion, let's focus on the hurt portion. So the hurt helper works very similar to how the jellyfish goes into the hurt state. You put the mummy object into the hurt state, you play the cut effect, which is, as you remember, the red kind of splash effect that happens when you initially hit, when the freeze frame is still going on. And then based on the position of the other object in respect to the mummy, either fire a hit left or a hit right event towards the hurt state. The hurt state is where we'll handle that event. So the mummy's hurt state works similar to how the jellyfish hurt state works, except that there's less cases to handle so far. Right now there's just a hit left or hit right depending on where the position of the incoming damage is coming from. So when we enter the state, we want to force the player to be invincible permanently, like don't time it out. We set a timer once the slow-mo is finished, and then we start timing it out. But to start, we want it to be permanent, as well as to detach the floor, because we're kind of I'll show you real quick, but when you get hurt, you get launched upwards. So if I'm in a standing state, I get launched upwards a little bit. So if I don't detach the floor, I actually sticky to the floor, which prevents me from going upwards like that. So I definitely wanted to have that. and then play the correct animation. So hit left and hit right work very similarly. Just it depends on what direction the enemy is coming from, so I'll just focus on hit left for now. So similar to how the jellyfish disables its physics, the mummy disables its physics for the slow motion period. Squishes horizontally, faces the direction that the damage is coming from, starts a slow motion, flashes white, and then shakes itself, similar to the same way the jellyfish did to show the impact. Once the shake is complete, that's when we start the invincibility timeout to reset back into the base state, as well as play the blood effect. Disable friction because there's no way for the user to input, so I don't want the user to slow down. I want the horizontal speed to continue in the direction that you've gotten hit from until the state is complete, and then re-enable physics with the desired speed. You can see hit right works in a very similar way. Pretty much all the exact same function calls, except you face a different direction, and the speed is in the negative direction as opposed to the positive direction from hit left. And when we exit the hurt state, we make sure we want to reset the friction back to enabled, as well as the physics, and then we start setting an invincibility timeout. So actually start flashing the invincibility. I'll show you how invincibility works really quick. So it's a very simple service. It has active attributes, and if you call permanent, it sets invincibility to true. Timeout will set it to true, as well as flash you on and off of basically the alpha flash that you saw earlier. And then when it's all done, it will return you back to non-invincible state and make sure that your alpha is set back to full alpha. So you can see when actually taking damage, it checks to make sure whether or not that invincibility active state has been set. And if it has, then don't actually take any damage. But if it has not been set, then feel free to take more damage because you can get hurt again. And that kind of sums up what I've been working on since the last video. It was a lot more polish on what I had been working on previously, and that will continue into next week most likely. I want to start adding sound as well as sound effects for the next video. I really want to, my end goal right now is just to be able to build a level. So at this point I want to make sure all of the damage is in place. Even if not everything is polished completely, I want to make sure it's a playable demo. Hopefully at some point I can get that so people can play it. It should be able to be playable in browser using Unity's web browser OpenGL build. I haven't actually tried that in a long time before. It's worked previously for me, but if that's possible, I'll let you know in a future video. Until then, I'll see you later. Take it easy.